G'day there folks, I'm back again. If you've seen my previous video, which I will be linking somewhere soon, I've just drawn the Indominus Rex's head in its most basic linear form. Now what I'm going to do is the tricky job of drawing in the scales. So I'm going to try my best to teach you guys some general things that I've noticed while studying her head, about how her scales work. So what I'll do is we'll start with the lower jaw, because this photo that I've been using as a reference seems to have a really good indication of how to draw her scales. So it seems what she has is just going to draw some basic lines. This is very different to how I usually draw scales, so her scales look very different to how I'd normally draw them. But she kind of has these curved lines that the scales all grid into. It seems that there's a bit of a line there, and they seem to contour with the shape of her jaw. So I'll draw that shape there. They seem to be 3D wireframe lines that the jaw kind of conforms to scale-wise. Around here it's a bit of a mishmash of scales, so I'm just going to sort of finish it here. And seems to be a bit of a line there. And then there's like a row of scales along here. So I'll do some more lines there, another line there. Some of the scales around here are a bit mishmashed, so that kind of gives you a general idea of how they work. I don't know if I'm not going to bother doing them too perfect. So we'll put in some of the lines for the scales up in here, following the kind of contour. You don't want to have them in a perfect grid structure, because then they won't look organic and natural. But if you kind of follow roughly along that shape, it kind of gives you the look of the scales. Around here it gets very mishmashed and complicated, but for the most part, just do your scales kind of squared, almost slight diamond shapes. Some of them a little bit diamond, some of them squarish. So kind of like that. Up here, I'm noticing, just to frame in my scales, that she has a few of the lip scales, but not too many. So like that, if that makes sense. So draw them in like that, and then they get narrower to the back of the jaw, and that's when they kind of get more sort of scattered, like your typical just general scales. I'm talking about scales all the time, yet I keep forgetting the word scales. I'm very good at narrating, aren't I? But okay, so that's kind of like how those scales look around there. It's kind of got a few little grid structures there, and here, from what I can see, it has some lines there that kind of seem to conform to a grid structure for scales. So we'll draw in these scales. Some of them are quite big, like there's 3 around here. I mean, I'm not doing this perfect by any stretch of the word, but very close. But these scales seem to be quite big. Especially around here, these scales seem to be quite big. And then they narrow down along the jaw. So, and around here, they're quite narrow. So her scales along her jaw are quite complicated and difficult at times. Depending on how long this video goes for, I don't know if I'll just time-lapse it, but we'll see. Seems to be a bit of a grid going on there, and then it's all mishmashy. We won't do it too perfectly. We'll just kind of get the general idea of the scales. But she seems to have very squared shaped, for the most part, square shaped scales along her jaw. And along here. And they get sort of more smaller and narrower here, to the point where they get to under her jaw. And they're more sort of squared around here. And then along here they get sort of elongated. Very much like a crocodile jaw, really. So yeah, around here she's very much she must have crocodile DNA in her, because her scales are very similar to crocodilian DNA. Crocodilian scales, I should say. Don't know if you guys can hear that, that's a plane. Okay, now just going to do these last few scales. Now, what I've noticed around her jaw is she's got, especially along these ones, she's got rotating scales along her teeth that kind of frame her teeth. So I'm going to draw the scales in like so. And draw some sort of fanning out. Like I said, the scales along her mouth are strange. They're not like your typical like Velociraptor or T-Rex. They come straight out of the mouth rather than having any gums. She doesn't appear to have any gums at all. So again, as I keep reiterating, she must have crocodile DNA in her, because that's how crocodile mouths usually look. So I'm just refining the mouth a bit. Going to put in a little bit of shade under some of those teeth. I'm going to render slightly some of those teeth. Put some lines along the length of your teeth. That will give them a bit of a texture. And when I do teeth, I make the base of their teeth a bit darker and then lighten them out as they get to the tip, which seems to be the structure for most teeth of animals in general. They're darker at the base and then brighter at the tip. So there we have some of our teeth. Okay, next up we'll do, I'm gonna do some of the scales along the top of her head. But what I'll do is I'll do these scales first. So she's got sort of platish scales along there. Seems to have 3 scales here. Along here, she seems to have some scales that form along her ear part. Then do some scales along here, some scales along there. There seems to be a row of scales along here, which also happens to be pretty much where the end of her head is. Around here, we have some of those lip scales that a lot of dinosaurs and reptiles have that go along their mouth, so we'll put them in. Then a sort of a circular scale there, then we'll just put some scales along here. They seem to be kind of, I don't know the exact shape, but they seem to be sort of 5-sided scales for the most part around this area. So I'm just going to do them like so. Some of them are 4-sided, some of them are 3-sided, but for the most part, do it like so. And then I'm going to put in a little bit of rendering there to bring out that part. Then some bigger bones, scales along there, some scales along here. Now, if I was going to spend even more time on this, I'd render each scale, but I don't think I want to spend that much time. So I just put in some lines along these bony scales. Then along here, she has a bunch of circularish, some of them are sort of squarish. I gotta stop saying sort of all the time. But you get the idea of these kind of scales. Put some of the scale around here, they kind of join together to form big scales. And around here, again like in here, she's got the kind of multiple-sided scales. So I'm putting them in. Some big scales up here. I don't even know how many people are going to end up watching all of this scale talk. But there might be some of you who want to learn the nitty-gritty. I'm going to put in some rendering to highlight that big ridgy bone. And I'm going to put some rendering up here for that ridgy bone and this ridged bone. So we're getting there now. I'm just going to render in that bit as well and emphasize my lines a little bit more. I'm just going to render in here with a brief bit of tone, and around here as well, just to, because it needs a bit of 3-dimensionalism to give it depth. We've drawn in our scales now, so this is when the rendering makes that scale lines seem less like lines and more just like texture, to make the skin look more like skin. There we go. Okay, now back to the scales. She seems to have a bunch of scales around here that frame her eye socket. So I'm doing those. Around here, she doesn't seem to have all that many, there seem to be sort of circular scales around here. So I'm just doing the circular scales. and around here. Some of them are big, some of them are little. And then the further you get into the eye, you kind of do scales like this. Do like little tiny scales. Yeah, might try and zoom in a little bit. That might give you a better indication of how I'm doing it. So do like scales along the folds. Little tiny long scales along the folds. To the point where they won't be visible much anymore. Do the same up around here. I'm going to make that eye socket a little bit more pronounced and defined. Bunch of little scales here. And some scales along here. You're doing it around the contour of the skin and the circular nature of the eye socket. So you do it like so. I'm going to render in some of the folds under her eye. Some scales there. Do some scales up above her eyebrow, not eyebrow, eyelid. Bring them around there. She seems to have a few scales just generically random around here. I'm going to give her her eyeball, well, her iris. So I'm going to give her a bit of that slit, and then some rendering up around here. Refine that edge. Some little veins for her iris. And she seems to have a bit of an eyeball, kind of like that. Refine that. And around here, let's see, using my reference images. Because I found, basically, the only one image I've found around here is the what you call it, the Mercedes-Benz ad. So that's the one with the best amount of scales. I'm just going to do like a bit of a grid structure around here, just for the sake of time. Otherwise, it'll be here forever. So I'm just going to draw these. And then you can go in there and refine some of those if you want. Do them down here. There's a lot of little tiny scales down here and around here. Around here are the big scales, and they are quite random and multi-sided, so there's no real tip or trick around there. So some of them are big, some of them are little. Around here they're all fairly little. And then go around the contour of that bone. Do some more scales there. Some of them are big, some of them are little. Render it in. Around here, just like the bottom teeth, she's got some sort of circulating scales that frame each tooth, and then you draw your sort of grid of scales coming out from there. So that's exactly what I'm going to do now. Kind of getting close to the end of this now. And hopefully this looks fairly detailed. Hopefully it gives you an idea of how to draw an Indominus Rex. So I'm just doing random shapes. Actually, oh, that's one. Oh no, that's the lower tooth. So I thought that was a different tooth, but it's not. Just do the different shapes around there that then evolve into the sort of grid structured teeth, not teeth, scales. So kind of like that. Then around the nose, this is where kind of the more interesting scales come in. She's got like these sort of bony ridged plate scales up here. That turn into, kind of look like they turn into sort of big plated scales. These are the scales that you don't really get to see that easily in the Mercedes-Benz ad. And around here, there's a whole bunch of sort of long, flat scales. So from the side view, they'll look like squares. So I'm just going to draw those in. And they kind of go the same way right to those knobby ridges. So I'll draw them in like that. And along here, she's got a line of sort of scales, much like these ones, but they're all in a sort of a line of scales that are more or less the same, right along the top of her snout. And it seems like she's got some slightly bigger scales along here. And then a bunch of scales along. Oh, you can sort of see those scales along in the this other photo that I'm using. So I'm going to do that line of scales. So a row of scales that are pretty uniform. Then you put some little scales in there. I'm gonna refine these scales a bit more, just to highlight that they are there. Around here is just like a bunch of little tiny scales that then evolve out into those lines of scales. And around here is kind of like those, much like these other random scales, like that. And then you put in your scales along the nose, the nostril. Just do them like that. Hopefully, there we go, just adjust my lighting a little bit. There we go, you can see that better now. And just going to put in some brief detail in there. Put in some brief detail there. And now I'm just going to do some brief rendering, but it looks like more or less we have ourselves an Indominus Rex. Which, to be honest, I just knocked my camera. I mean, between you and me, I actually think that looks quite good. It's not too bad at all. Considering I've actually gone in there and actually detailed most of those scales, which I don't usually do. So then I'm just going to refine these bits and pieces. Just bring a bit of shading and depth. Put a bit of shading under her snout. Just going to circulate around here. I'm going to make her eye a little bit darker over here. Make the tooth a little bit more so you can sort of see it more defined so you can see the teeth properly. She seems to have a little bit of a line there, so I'm just going to do that in there. But yeah, I think that looks kind of good. And I mean, if you really want to put in extra detail into the neck, you can. But, and apologies for that. That's the shading of my camera, or the shadow of my camera. So I'm just trying to get some good lighting so you guys can see. There we go. So hopefully that's given you some ideas on how to do scales and that of Indominus Rex. This part was far more advanced than the other part, so yes. This side's a lot darker, but from the preview of the webcam, it looks like it's quite bright. So I'm not going to ruin it too much by trying to shadow it for the sake of the thing. But there you have it. That is how I drew an Indominus Rex scaled for the first time properly. Like, I have drawn Indominus Rex once or twice before, but this is the first time to put all that detail into the scales. So, if you've learnt something, please give me a thumbs up, and if you haven't already done so, please subscribe, and I'll probably do some more like this in the future. Maybe not to this extreme level of detail with the, at least not narrated and taught, but I will have more videos in the future. But yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed this. This has been a very time-consuming video. If you've watched it right through to the end, wow, you've got dedication. I might do a time-lapse version of this as well, just to make things a little bit quicker for those who just want to see the build-up. But yes, that's the Indominus Rex. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you all next time. Catch you later.